In the wilderness of Alaska, where endless snow-covered mountain ranges stretch to the horizon, winter is not merely a season but a test of survival. The biting cold cuts through even the thickest layers of clothing, transforming every sound into faint echoes in the frozen air. Amid this unforgiving land, Ethan Carter's small log cabin stood solitary, a tiny anchor against the ferocity of nature. The cabin was surrounded by towering pine trees, ancient sentinels that had withstood hundreds of winters, offering some protection against the piercing wind. Ethan had built this home 6 years ago after leaving the glittering lights of New York City. Once a renowned wildlife photographer celebrated for his evocative images, he had found no peace in fame. The tranquility of Alaska's wilderness was what he had longed for, a place where every day was a survival journey, an opportunity to connect with nature on its most profound level. That winter night, the air carried an unusual tension. The cold wind sliced through the forest like a blade, howling with a sound that resembled the lament of the earth itself. Temperatures had plunged to a perilous 45°C, so frigid that everything seemed to come to a standstill. Ethan sat by the fireplace, listening to the crackling of the wood as golden flames cast flickering light on his face, marked by time and solitude. Through the frost-covered window, he gazed at the vast expanse of white outside. Snow had piled up over a meter thick, blanketing everything in an eerie silence. Ethan had no way of knowing that on this quiet winter night, the peace he had sought for the past 6 years was about to be challenged by the greatest ordeal of his life. Out there, nature was preparing a ruthless test, not only of his physical strength but also of his compassion, survival instincts, and the true meaning of existence in an unyielding world. In this desolate stillness, Ethan was unaware that in just a few hours, he would have to make a decision that would change everything, a choice that would not only affect him, but also touch the deep connection between humans and the wild, a bond he cherished yet had never truly been tested. The unnatural cold seeped into every corner of the forest, infiltrating through the wooden cracks of Ethan's small cabin, as if daring anyone to defy it. The temperature had dropped to an unimaginable 45°C, freezing the air itself and turning any movement outside into a battle against nature. Though Ethan was accustomed to Alaska's harsh winters, he couldn't help but feel the pressure. The firelight danced on his face, highlighting the rugged features of a man who had faced many challenges in life. His hair, streaked with grey not from age but from years of enduring this unforgiving land, framed his determined expression. At 42, Ethan possessed an unyielding survival instinct and a steely discipline. He meticulously checked his supplies: oil lamps, canned food, thermal blankets, and dry firewood. Everything had to be in order because, on nights like these, even the smallest mistake could be catastrophic. His log cabin sat amidst towering pines, the ancient trees swaying under the assault of a brutal wind. The howling gusts through the treetops sounded like the cries of wild beasts, amplifying the oppressive atmosphere. Ethan cracked open the window slightly to check the storm, and a blast of icy wind rushed in, carrying fine snowflakes into the room. He quickly shut it, adjusted the oil lamp on the table, and reminded himself that he just needed to make it through the night. But then, amidst the howling wind and the cracking of branches under the strain, a different sound emerged. Ethan froze, his hands mid-motion as he stacked firewood. The sound was deep, drawn out like a low, mournful wail. His heartbeat quickened. It wasn't the wind, nor the trees. It was an animal. Grabbing his flashlight, Ethan approached the frosted window. He wiped away the thick layer of ice to peer outside. In the blackness of the storm and the raging snowfall, his eyes gradually adjusted, and he saw them. 3 silhouettes, 1 large and 2 small, were trudging slowly through the snow, nearly swallowed by the storm. The smaller shapes stumbled, their frail legs barely able to resist the wind, while the larger figure shielded them with its body like a living barrier. Ethan held his breath. Bears! A mother bear and her 2 cubs. Ethan felt his chest tighten. He had seen bears many times during his photography expeditions, but never under circumstances like these. Bears typically hibernate during this season. Their presence in a snowstorm could mean only one thing: they had been forced out of their den. He studied them closely, the beam of his flashlight trembling in his hand. The mother bear was dragging herself forward with painstaking effort, her massive paws sinking deep into the snow. The cubs staggered behind her, barely able to keep going. Their thick fur, usually a proud insulation, was now coated with frost. Snow clung to their bodies, rendering them nearly motionless in the bitter cold. The wind howled louder, rattling the windows. Ethan glanced back at the crackling fire, then returned his gaze to the struggling bear family outside. "They'll die out there," he murmured, his voice hoarse with tension. But another thought pierced through his mind. Bears, especially a mother with cubs, are dangerous. If he tried to help, he might be putting his own life at risk. Outside, the mother bear suddenly halted. She crouched, using her body to shield the trembling cubs. Ethan could hear a low growl from her, weak and subdued, as if she were trying to comfort her young, even as she neared exhaustion. Ethan took a deep breath. He knew he didn't have much time to decide. If he did nothing, the three of them wouldn't survive the night. But if he intervened, things could spiral out of control. The storm continued to rage, and the frost crept over everything, consuming the world in its icy grip. Ethan stood motionless, staring at the bear family, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. In that moment, he wasn't just facing a snowstorm, he was confronting a tempest within his own soul. The wind lashed against the wooden cabin, creating long, eerie howls that echoed through the frozen landscape. Ethan stood motionless by the window, his eyes fixed on the three struggling silhouettes braving the storm. The mother bear, massive yet exhausted, trudged forward with heavy steps through the deep snow. The two cubs clung close to her side, small and frail, their trembling legs barely able to take another step. Ethan realized they were desperately searching for shelter. Each breath he took fogged up the frosted window, leaving a thin layer of condensation that quickly froze in the biting cold. He wiped the glass clean again, his flashlight trembling as it illuminated the bear family. Details became clearer. Their thick fur, now laden with frost, locked in the last remnants of warmth. The cubs, much smaller than they should have been for their age, were clearly born late in the season, leaving their fragile bodies ill-equipped to withstand this brutal weather. Ethan's heart tightened. He had photographed countless animals in the harshest survival scenarios, but he had never witnessed anything as heart-wrenching as this. The mother bear let out a low growl, hoarse and strained, as though urging her cubs to keep moving. But the cubs could no longer respond. One of them suddenly collapsed into the snow, and with what little strength she had left, the mother bear leaned down and nudged it gently with her snout, urging it back to its feet. Ethan turned away, leaning against the wall with his eyes shut tight. His mind swirled with conflicting thoughts. "Don't do anything stupid, Ethan," he muttered, gripping the flashlight tightly. "That's a bear, not a house pet. If you open that door, she'll charge in and kill you in seconds." But another voice, quieter yet no less insistent, spoke in his mind. "Can you really just stand here and watch? They're barely clinging to life. If you don't do something now, tonight will be their last." He turned back to the window. The mother bear had almost collapsed into the snow, her massive body shielding the cubs as much as it could. The blizzard's relentless gusts whipped up the snow, creating a blinding white veil, but Ethan could still see her eyes. Those eyes no longer held the ferocity he associated with wild animals. Instead, they reflected exhaustion and, strangely, profound sorrow. It wasn't just the gaze of a wild creature, it was the gaze of a mother willing to do anything to protect her young, even at the cost of her own life. Ethan tightened the strap of his coat, the cold seeping deeper into his skin. Inside, the battle between logic and compassion raged on. He knew the risks. Even in her weakened state, the mother bear could attack him in an instant if she felt threatened. But he couldn't ignore the plea in her eyes. He walked over to the table and grabbed a pair of binoculars for a closer look. The mother bear was trying to dig through the snow with her massive paws, creating a shallow depression for her cubs to shelter in. But the fierce wind quickly erased all her efforts. The cubs huddled together, their breaths growing weaker. One of them began to shiver violently, a clear sign of severe hypothermia. Ethan felt the weight of each passing second. If he didn't act now, they would die. He glanced at the fireplace in the corner, its warm golden glow casting a comforting light across the small cabin. Then his eyes drifted to the door leading to the icy wilderness outside. Taking a deep breath, Ethan went to the storage cabinet and pulled out 2 heavy blankets and an extra flashlight. He opened the door to the nearby storage shed, only a few meters from the main cabin, and turned on its heating system to full blast. The shed was insulated and just large enough to provide the bears with warmth at least for one night. Returning to the window, Ethan saw the bear family struggling outside, his heart pounding. He realized that his decision would not only test his compassion but would also become the greatest challenge he had ever faced. He reached for the door handle, the cold metal sending a chill up his arm. Closing his eyes, Ethan listened to the sound of his racing heartbeat mingling with the howling wind. He knew that opening this door could change everything forever. Without giving himself another moment to hesitate, he pulled the door open. The freezing wind rushed in, carrying snowflakes and the deafening roar of the storm. Ethan stepped out onto the porch, his flashlight cutting through the swirling snow. The mother bear lifted her head, her exhausted eyes locking onto him. In that moment, those eyes conveyed a single message: "Please, help us." Ethan stood on the porch steps, his hand gripping the flashlight so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The icy wind pierced through his thick layers of clothing, stabbing into his skin and making every muscle in his body tense. He lowered his head, trying to steady his breathing, but his chest felt constricted under an invisible weight. How did I end up here? Ethan wondered aloud, though his question wasn't about geography but about his own heart. He had left everything behind: the blinding lights of New York, the endless city noise, and the relationships that had faded over time to seek a simpler, quieter life. But now that tranquility seemed to have betrayed him, thrusting him into a situation where no rulebook could guide him. Outside, the flashlight's beam trembled over the silhouettes of the mother bear and her cubs. The mother bear raised her head, her cloudy eyes still reflecting a faint glimmer in the light. Though tired and nearly hopeless, her gaze carried a trace of vigilance, the protective instinct of a wild animal. Ethan swallowed hard and stepped slowly down the porch. The cold seeped into every pore, but it was nothing compared to the fear swelling inside him. His survival instincts screamed at him to turn back, shut the door, and let nature take its course. But every time he looked at the trembling cubs in the snow, his heart ached. When Ethan placed the first blanket near the cubs, he held his breath. His every movement was slow and deliberate, as if he were walking a tightrope between life and death. The mother bear let out a low growl, weak but still startling enough to make Ethan freeze. He stepped back a few paces, his eyes never leaving her, waiting. The mother bear lowered her head, her snout brushing against the blanket. A strange stillness settled over the scene, broken only by the wind's howling. Ethan barely dared to breathe as he watched the mother bear drag the blanket closer to her cubs with surprising care. She wrapped it around their fragile bodies, her movements almost human in their tenderness. At that moment, a surge of emotion overwhelmed Ethan. He had thought he understood nature, had seen its cruelty and wild beauty through the lens of his camera. But now he realized he had only scratched the surface. Maternal love, something he once believed to be uniquely human, was now evident before his eyes in the form of an exhausted mother bear fighting for her cub's survival. I can't let them die, Ethan thought, the realization cutting through his fear and self-preservation. It became a beacon, pushing aside the shadows of hesitation. Ethan stepped forward again, this time placing the second blanket even closer. His breath hung frozen in the air, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. The mother bear kept her eyes fixed on him, but there was no growling this time. Instead, her gaze held something Ethan couldn't fully articulate: acceptance, maybe even trust. As Ethan retreated, the mother bear pulled the second blanket over her cubs, then used her massive body to shield them, forming a final fortress against the merciless cold. Ethan stood still, his heart heavy with a mixture of fear and reverence. Do they understand? He wondered, his gaze fixed on the three creatures slowly merging into one warm huddle amidst the snowstorm. Perhaps the mother bear didn't know who he was, or why he was helping them, but those eyes told him she understood this was her last chance to survive. Ethan turned toward the storage shed, where the heater was already warming the space. He opened the door, allowing a soft glow of warmth to spill into the freezing night. Kneeling, he placed another blanket near the shed's entrance, a silent invitation. Then he stepped back, keeping a safe distance, and waited. The wind howled louder, blowing snowflakes into his face. Ethan stood unmoving, gripping his flashlight tightly. The mother bear raised her head again, her eyes meeting his. In that moment, Ethan felt an unspoken connection, an invisible thread binding them. No words, no actions, just a shared understanding of a single goal: survival. With slow, deliberate steps, the mother bear began inching toward the shed, dragging the two cubs still wrapped in blankets behind her. Ethan exhaled sharply, feeling as though he had just passed a monumental test. But he knew this was only the beginning. Time seemed to crawl in the biting cold. Ethan stood frozen on the porch, his hand clutching the flashlight so tightly that pain shot through his fingers. Around him, the world blurred into a white void of snow, leaving only the sight of the mother bear, slowly dragging herself toward the shed. Each step she took seemed like a battle against death itself. The two small cubs, swaddled in blankets, swayed weakly with her movements. The wind roared through the treetops, yet all Ethan could hear was the pounding of his own heartbeat, reverberating like a drum signaling the fragility of life. He stood at a distance, eyes never leaving the bear family. Each inch the mother bear advanced brought both relief and anguish to his chest. The mother bear's legs trembled as she dragged the blanket and her cubs closer to the shed's door. Her breath formed thin, misty clouds, each exhale weaker than the last, as though she were expending the very last reserves of her strength. Ethan saw the frost clinging to her fur and the dullness in her eyes, a testament to her exhaustion. Yet what he couldn't look away from was the faint light of determination, a fierce, primal will to protect her young. "Come on," he whispered, his voice nearly drowned out by the wind. When the mother bear finally reached the shed's threshold, she paused, lowering her head to sniff at the partially open door, where warmth seeped out like a gentle beckoning. The cubs, still wrapped in their blankets, lay motionless. Ethan's heart clenched. Were they still alive? With clumsy, deliberate movements, the mother bear nudged the blanket, checking on her cubs. One of them stirred faintly, letting out a weak cry. Ethan released a shaky breath of relief, though he knew time was running out. He stepped forward cautiously, his body trembling not just from the cold but from the tension coursing through him. The mother bear raised her head to meet his gaze, her eyes a mix of wariness and trust. In that silent exchange, both seemed to understand that this was an unspoken agreement. Her cub's survival now depended on his actions. "Go inside," Ethan murmured, knowing full well she couldn't understand his words. Summoning the last of her strength, the mother bear lowered herself, gently gripping the blanket in her jaws. She pulled her cubs over the threshold into the warmth of the shed. Once all three were inside, Ethan approached slowly, his hands trembling as he grasped the door. The mother bear turned to look at him, her gaze no longer filled with panic or fear but with profound gratitude. Ethan closed the door gently, the creak of the hinges barely audible over the storm's relentless howl. When the door clicked shut, he leaned against it, his breaths coming in heavy gasps, his legs nearly giving out beneath him. A strange sense of relief washed over him, but it was quickly replaced by an overwhelming worry. Inside the shed, the heater's warmth began to fill the small space. Ethan peered through the tiny window, his flashlight illuminating the three huddled figures. The mother bear, no longer bracing herself to shield her cubs, curled around them, her massive body offering what little warmth she had left. Through the dim light, Ethan saw the smallest cub twitch slightly, a fragile sign of life. A surge of emotion welled up in Ethan's chest, a blend of relief and sorrow. He knew he had broken every survival rule he had learned over the years, but as he stood there, watching the scene unfold, he felt no regret. "I did the right thing," he thought, his vision blurring as tears formed, freezing against his cheeks. Outside, the storm continued to roar, as though testing the resolve of every creature in the forest. But inside that tiny shed, a miracle was taking place. Ethan stood there, gazing through the frosted glass, his heart no longer as cold as it had been. He knew that whatever tomorrow might bring, tonight he had done what needed to be done. And that was all that mattered. Ethan stood on the cabin's porch, his eyes fixed on the distant treeline where the Bear family had disappeared. The footprints in the snow were gradually being erased by the wind, but the image of the three creatures remained vivid in his mind. In the lingering cold left by the storm, an unexpected warmth crept into his heart, thawing the loneliness that had long frozen his soul. A gentle breeze rustled through the pines, carrying faint, soothing whispers from the forest. Ethan no longer felt alone in this wilderness. He realized that in the moment he chose to open the door and save the Bear family, he hadn't just rescued them, he had also saved himself. For so long he believed he had escaped the chaos of the city, the tangled relationships, and the relentless pressure of his past life. But in truth, he had been running from a deeper disconnection from people, from nature, and from his own heart. When he looked into the mother bear's eyes and saw that fragile yet profound trust, he understood that compassion wasn't just an instinct, it was the thread that bound humanity to the world around them. During the 2 days of the snowstorm, each time Ethan placed water and food near the shed door, he felt an unfamiliar sense of tranquility. It wasn't the silence of loneliness, but the peace that comes from knowing he was doing the right thing. Standing at a distance, he watched the Bear family recover slowly. The mother bear grew stronger, standing more firmly, her eyes no longer clouded with exhaustion, but shining with a renewed determination to protect her cubs. On the morning of the 3rd day, as the sun rose over the snow-covered mountains, Ethan opened the shed door. A rush of cold air swept in, but it carried with it the gentle light of a new day after 3 stormy nights. The mother bear stood, guiding her 2 cubs out into the open. The cubs, now sturdier, wobbled after her, leaving tiny, playful prints in the pristine snow. When they reached the edge of the forest, the mother bear paused. She turned to look back at Ethan. In that silent moment, it felt as though the entire world had come to a standstill. Her eyes held gratitude, trust, and a profound understanding that transcended words. Ethan stood still, only a few dozen meters away, but in that moment, the gap between man and nature seemed to disappear entirely. As the Bear family disappeared into the shelter of the trees, Ethan remained on the porch, watching the last traces of their footprints slowly vanish beneath fresh snow. A soft smile crossed his face, not born of satisfaction but of a sense that he had reclaimed something long lost. He realized that choosing to save the Bear family was not just an act of bravery, it was a reminder that even in the harshest and coldest of worlds, compassion has the power to melt the deepest frost in one's soul. Sometimes, to truly live, we must step beyond our fears and the rigid rules we impose on ourselves to reconnect with what truly matters. When Ethan stepped back into the cabin, the fire in the hearth seemed warmer, and the light in the room felt brighter. Within him, another fire of compassion and connection burned more fiercely than ever before. Ethan's story was not just about survival, it was a lesson in humanity. It was a testament that even in the most unforgiving circumstances, compassion can transcend all barriers, bringing us closer to the world around us and illuminating the darkest corners of our hearts.